Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the fifth chapter of the second book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege. The text follows. We have still a most important subject to consider, which is how far criticism in passing judgments on particular events is permitted or in duty bound to make use of its wider view of things and therefore also what which is shown by results, or when and where it should leave out sight of these things in order to place itself, as far as possible, in the exact position of the chief actor. If criticism dispenses praise or censure, it should seek to place itself as nearly as possible at the same point of view as the person acting, that is to say, to collect all he knew and all the motives on which he acted, and on the other hand to leave out of the consideration all that the person acting could not or did not know, and above all, the result. But this is only an object to aim at, which can never be reached, because the state of circumstances from which an event proceeded can never be placed before the eye of the critic exactly as it lay before the eye of the person acting. A number of inferior circumstances which must have influenced the result are completely lost to sight, and many a subjective motive has never come to light. The latter can only be learned from the memoirs of the chief actor or from his intimate friends, and in such things of this kind are often treated of in a very desultory manner or purposely misrepresented. Criticism, therefore, always forego much which was present in the minds of those whose acts are criticized. On the other hand, it is much more difficult to leave out of sight that which criticism knows in excess. This is only easy as regards accidental circumstances, that is, circumstances which have been mixed up, but are in no way necessarily related. But it is very difficult, and in fact can never be completely done with regard to things really essential. Let us take first the result. If it has not proceeded from accidental circumstances, it is almost impossible that the knowledge of it should not have an effect on the judgment passed on events which have preceded it, for we see these things in the light of this result, and it is to a certain extent by it that we first become acquainted with them and appreciate them. Military history, with all its events, is a source of instruction for criticism itself, and it is only natural that criticism should throw that light on things which it has itself obtained from the consideration of the whole. If therefore it might wish in some cases to leave the result out of consideration, it would be impossible to do so completely. But it is not only in relation to the result, that is, with what takes place at the last, that is, embarrassment arises. The same occurs in relation to preceding events, therefore, with the data which furnished in the motives to action. Criticism has before it, in most cases, more information on this point than the principal in the transaction. Now, it may seem easy to dismiss from the consideration everything of this nature, but it is not so easy as we may think. The knowledge of preceding and concurrent events is founded not only on certain information, but on a number of conjectures and suppositions. Indeed, there is hardly any of the information respecting things not purely accidental which has not been preceded by suppositions or conjectures destined to take the place of certain information in case such should never be supplied. Now, is it conceivable that criticism in after times, which has before it as facts all the preceding and concurrent circumstances, should not allow itself to be thereby influenced when it asks itself the question, what portion of the circumstances which at the moment of action were unknown would it have held to be probable? We maintain that in this case, and as in the case of the results, and for the same reason, it is impossible to disregard all these things completely. If therefore the critic wishes to bestow praise or blame upon any single act, he can only succeed to a certain degree in placing himself in the position of the person whose act he has under review. In many cases he can do so sufficiently near for any practical purpose, but in many instances it is the very reverse, and this fact should never be overlooked. But it is neither necessary nor desirable that criticism should completely identify itself with the person acting. In war, as in all matters of skill, there is a certain natural aptitude required which is called talent. This may be great or small. In the first case it may easily be superior to that of the critic, for what critic can pretend to the skill of a Frederick or a Bonaparte? Therefore, if criticism is not to abstain altogether from offering an opinion where eminent talent is concerned, it must be allowed to make use of the advantage which its enlarged horizon affords. Criticism must not therefore treat the solution of a problem by a great general like a sum in arithmetic. It is only through the results and through the exact coincidences of events that it can recognize with admiration how much is due to the exercise of genius, and that it first learns the essential combination which the glance of that genius devised. But for every, even the smallest, act of genius, it is necessary that criticism should take a higher point of view, so that having at command many objective grounds of decision, it may be as little subjective as possible, in that the critic may not take the limited scope of his own mind as a standard. This elevated position of criticism, its praise and blame pronounced with full knowledge of all the circumstances, has in itself nothing which hurts our feelings. It only does so if the critic pushes himself forward and speaks in a tone as if all the wisdom which he has obtained by an exhaustive examination of the event under consideration were really his own talent. Palpable as is this deception, it is one which people may easily fall into through vanity, and one which is naturally distasteful to others. It very often happens that although the critic has no such arrogant pretensions, they are imputed to him by the reader because he has not expressly disclaimed them, and then follows immediately a charge of a want of the power of critical judgment. If therefore critic points out an error made by a Frederick or a Bonaparte, that does not mean that he who makes the criticism would not have committed the same error. He may even be ready to grant that had he been in place of these great generals, he might have made much greater mistakes. He merely sees this error from the chain of events, and he thinks that it should not have escaped the sagacity of the general. This is therefore an opinion formed through the connection of events, and therefore through the result. But there is another quite different effect of the result itself upon the judgment, that is, if it is used quite alone as an example for or against the soundness of a measure. This may be called judgment according to the result. Such a judgment appears at first sight inadmissible, and yet it is not. So this is by far one of the most important passages of the whole Vom Kriege. Right, so von Clausewitz here fundamentally explains what should we do about our military history proper, about our inquiry in order to on a military event, in order to draw from it some notion, right? Do we have to stick just to the cause effect chain and not expressing any judgment? And if we want actually to do so, how far should we go in this? And that's why this passage is so beautiful, because it poses you in front of a lot of problems that are actually the very cream of historical inquiry, aside from the strictly military point of view. But that, as we have seen, for the sake of the theory of the art of war, is very important, because this theory should produce fundamentally a doctrine of some kind on the basis of the same observations. Therefore, it's very important how we judge military history, and don't believe in this regard that everything is being settled, that more or less we know everything could be said, right? It is true that if you take a single military event, take the Napoleonic era has been studied, I mean, literally ever since it occurred, so we have 200 years and more of historiography that has covered exhaustively these events. But you know, many fields of military history still need expansion, and even that knowledge, and this is the important thing, could enter in relation with the Napoleonic warfare proper to get actually even a better understanding. Now the whole thing is very complicated. It gets down to philosophy in some ways, and we will not discuss it obviously today. But always bear in mind that in this regard we are, and von Clausewitz is showing it brilliantly, we're dealing with an object that is continuously changing, right? Because it's not that the evidence of anything in history is just what you have in front of your eyes, and so it is, right? Everything is the perception you get from it, you get of it and from it, and we get constantly tricked all the time, right? And our knowledge about that specific object is always imperfect, and it also varies. It varies as many are the people that look at it and try to study it and interpret it, right? So von Clausewitz writes, we have still a most important subject to consider, which is how far criticism in passing judgments on particular events is permitted, or in duty bound to make use of its wider view of things, and therefore also of that which is shown by results. That is, how much can we learn from the simple observation of facts and their chaining, as we have seen, and especially of the results, and then or when and where should leave out sight of these things in order to place itself as far as possible in the exact position of the chief actor, right? So this is a very, very important question. That is, do we stick to the story, right, or we try to do something more advanced? That is, okay, in order to have a really critical and more accurate inquiry, we should try to be in the shoes of that commander and starting making a history of what his knowledge, his perception, his awareness of what was going on actually was, right? And von Clausewitz writes, if criticism dispenses praise or censure, right? So that is, okay, it may designate in the commander also to criticize positively or negatively his performance, right? It should seek to place itself as nearly as possible at the same point of view as the person acting, that is to say, to collect all he knew and all the motives on which he acted, and on the other hand, to leave out of the consideration all that the person acting could not or did not know, and above all, the result. So only by reading this you understand all the problems that it poses, right? It's really about you, right? It's not about pretending to objectify the mind of a person in order to study it, right? It's practically impossible, and also you should be always aware in the first place of studying or approaching this topic by realizing that while we can reconstruct what partially that person know, you still know things that at the moment of those decisions were taken by the commander, there were things that you know that person didn't know, right? So this biases you much because you sometimes have this conflictual aim, if you want, that is not only to understand what happened, but also pertaining to be kind of objective in the judgment, in that sense, which even if they are not incompatible, they have different aims. The one is practically realizing that trying to realize what was happening at the time, and the other one is criticizing someone on the basis of the fact that not everything that was known at the time was known to that person, but also how can we know, and how also can be we confident most of the time. So it's a very common mistake to pretend that what we know today is also all that was known at the time by the commander, or it is what actually happened in the first place. Because this is impossible. In fact, von Clausewitz writes, but this is only an object to aim at, right? Like most of Clausewitz in theory, this is really the point, right? Is talking by extremes, by absolutes, to understand how wildly our understanding of certain things can range based on all the things that can happen within those boundaries, right? But this is only an object to aim at, which can never be reached because the state of circumstances from which an event proceeded can never be placed before the eye of the critic exactly as it lay before the eye of the person acting. This is the first and most important deal, right? We weren't the person, right? Nobody knows what's in other people's mind, what that person really knows, right? I would say we also tend to overcomplicate things. That is, von Clausewitz has explained us how, after all, the military talent is not much one of a great capability of abstraction, but at least someone who is able to spot those more important things that are going on, right, in this ocean of this stormy ocean of data that is incomplete, partial. It doesn't. It's also kind of contrasting within itself. So it's obvious if you think about it that generally speaking, that the narratives of what battles have been tend to highlight those kind of simple factors. But aside from the fact it could be wrong, as we will see now, because we're never been there, right? And in certain places, like, we don't even know people that had been there and that even expressed opinions regarding to that, right? Because even some of the greatest battles in history, if I think about especially the ancient world, it's mostly a third person that is talking about this stuff, right? Usually, and even in those first-person cases, like take Caesar for example, it's not that the aim is actually the one of making you understand what the thing really was, right? It's still a narrative, and this kind of alludes also to strictly military problem. It's right, it's cultural, right? It depends on political goals and lots of things that we can't know about, or at least we can know about, but we will never know how much they directly influence and how and why. Also, most of the times we don't know which the sources of such knowledge actually was, right? If you study, let's say, medieval battle accounts, there's plenty of chroniclers. Some were actually eyewitness, but most of them were not, and they simply talk, and they don't bother to themselves to tell you where they got that information from. So how could it happen, right? Or just hypothesis, and this is most of what history fundamentally is, and this information is regularly altered, right? These are all things we should be very careful about and aware of, but that also shouldn't be so depressing for us, so discouraging, because actually through that knowledge we can also read a lot of important stuff that through comparison, right, and also kind of a more expanded understanding of warfare, you can spot as sensible and relatively reliable information. The other thing I want to say to remember Oh, and yes, however, the most banal thing, we're not the person on the battlefield, right? We also, not only we're not the person who wrote afterwards about those things, we're not the person who was there at the time when the thing was still in the future, right, and had yet to happen, and that happened also because of the decisions that were taken by that person at the moment, with an evidence that most of the times we don't understand, as we will see better now. And von Clausewitz writes further, a number of inferior circumstances which must have influenced the result are completely lost to sight. This is another major deal, right? And many a subjective motive has never come to light. This is something we can all relate to, right? I always make an example, try to explain, I don't know, something that happened to you once, and think for a moment all what you're going to say about it for whichever reason, right? What you're not going to say about it for whichever reason, that are often very, very important. Some of the most decisive aspects of the story. Maybe it's something you don't want to be known, or maybe, I don't know, it's there's sensible information you cannot release in some ways, or maybe you're not sure whether something was true or not, because you may actually even forget about it. But also think, and this is very, very fascinating, about all those things that you're thinking, but that you don't say because you think they're of secondary importance, or maybe you kind of perceive, or you think you have thought, because this is another important thing, that we build narratives on our own, right? If something happened to us and we come back thinking on them, we pass through. First of all, we remember just certain aspects of it. There is a partial memory of it, and then this memory gets kind of reshaped by ourselves, by, let's say, highlighting certain points that at the time that in that specific moment we think they were more important, but after all that really weren't. Sometimes we are even able to trace that back, like saying, okay, maybe at that time in my life I remembered that event in a way because I was more caring about this aspect at the time, and now instead I realize maybe I was even right before thinking that kind of more developed thought. It all goes by this. So think what it means to perceive something and to be an eyewitness of something like a battle, like think of just a riot, right? Can you actually explain all what was going on? Who were the people involved? How the thing unfolded? Like it's very, very difficult. Like you can't you can be vivid. Also, you realize that you're essentially telling the story from your own point of view. I mean, when you put yourself in relation to the event, you kind of say, okay, I perceive that, because it's natural, it's instinctual, and guess why? Because all events are complicated, and we immediately realize. So we try to start from ourselves, and even putting the attention on this subjective perspective, when actually we could make an effort to be a bit more constructive and objective, which is difficult. It's even costly, right? It's tiring in some way, so we tend not to do. So we also interiorize things in different matters that maybe are not so important compared to what actually happened. Think about people who live in historical events of great importance, and then they don't really understand it, because all they cared about at the time was, yeah, there was this big thing going, but after all, I was still caring about my own business, and I didn't make an effort to understand it much, right? Don't think that living in an historical period means to be minimally competent about it, right? You can know a bunch of things more than a person that has never been there, but still, I don't know, having lived, I know it sounds harsh, but having lived, for example, during World War II, in the way we can revere people who kind of even fought for a good reason, etc., that by itself, right, it's not a satisfactory condition by far to understand the slightest about what the hell was going on in the first place. And I'm very serious about this. Like the reason we are blind to so many aspects, just because to us we want to tell our own story, right? We want our narrative to be, put on the fore, etc. And then what about other people? What about our even, limits deriving exactly from concentrating on a narrow individual perspective, right? For example, look at I mean, sadly, our grandparents or great grandparents passing away. I mean, people who have lived during World War II are slowly leaving us, and therefore, rightfully, many people were interested in World War II. They care about the elderly. They just started documenting a lot of stuff about their times, their impressions, their stories. But if you look at it, to me, it seems there is an imbalance between for whichever, because there are also other reasons to that, between what the witness of that person actually is, right, and the general understanding of the whole picture, which is still radically lacking by far, basically all over the world. There is not even a single country in which, I don't know, people have a minimally satisfactory understanding on average of things like World War II, Cold War, whatever you wanna choose. And I'm very serious once again about this. So these are examples just to make you understand how, deeply we basically don't realize most of the times what the hell happened in the first place, even when something is fairly close to us, right? Or we may have even partaken in. The thing should make you reflect, because it's literally about every single aspect of your life, right? And then von Clausewitz goes on, and it's important to say before we continue that von Clausewitz says that most of this information will never actually brought on the fore, right? And not just what actually happened, but also what you were feeling about it. Mind this, because it's people who create documentary evidence, so which is most of the times the most direct and best information we can rely on after all. So all this should be always considered as a natural fault of our historical accuracy. And von Clausewitz goes on and says, the latter can only be learned from the memoirs of the chief actor, or from his intimate friends, and in such things of kind are often treated in a very desultory manner, or purposely misrepresented. So, really, von Clausewitz has hinted at more than once how effectively the memoirs of commanders are possibly the best source that can shed light on most military engagements. Why? Because that person was in charge, so great part of what happened depended on the person, and the person who writes about that is by far the precious evidence we have, right? And it's correct. The problem is that this memory is often altered purposely, or just for natural reasons, in a way that that is very dangerous, because the mistake is in that specific source, and the more our historical understanding about that event gets blurred, right, and gets confused at least, or maybe even actually told in a specific way that is neatly shaped but is actually wrong because it's been made up. And von Clausewitz says, criticism must therefore always forego much which was present in the minds of those whose acts are criticized. Then he adds, on the other hand, it is much more difficult to leave out of sight that which criticism knows in excess, right? This is important. There is also a huge amount of information most of the times that is is important, and you understand even what you could theoretically carve from it, but you must realize what's your chance of connecting it effectively to what you need to know, right? There is a lot of information that you shouldn't be distracted by while you focus on what should really matter. And von Clausewitz writes, this is only easy as regards accidental circumstances, that is, circumstances which have been mixed up but are in no way necessarily related. But it is very difficult, and in fact can never be completely done with regard to things really essential. Big problem is understanding which ones these are. And von Clausewitz starts from the end, let's say, saying let us take first the result, right? If it has not proceeded from accidental circumstances, it is almost impossible that the knowledge of it should not have an effect on the judgment passed on events which have preceded it. For we see these things in the light of this result, and it is to a certain extent by it that we first become acquainted with them and appreciate them. This is absolutely true. I mean, most of the historical events that we study are basically brutal facts that, were consequences of a lot of factors, evidently, that, however, we deem as central because that's the big thing that happened. Then the difficult thing is determining why that thing happened in the first place. Now, as we've seen also in the previous videos, von Clausewitz attributes a great importance to the result in itself. That is, something in military history you can't really do without, because even if the result was just a result of pure accident, still that has kind of a specific weight on its own that is very high and must be considered, right? And most of the times in history, more specifically military history, we tend to judge things from results, right? Or at least to start knowing them chiefly from those. And von Clausewitz adds, military history with all its events is a source of instruction for criticism itself, and it is only natural that criticism should throw that light on things which it has itself obtained from the consideration of the whole, right? If therefore it might wish in some cases to leave the result out of the consideration, it would be impossible to do so completely, right? Because the result, even if you were to go back, it's still the starting point, right? So even if you found out that, I don't know, a general still did well after all in the place of his command during a battle or a campaign, and he lost anyway, you have to reconcile this eventually with the result. That is, what went wrong, because for the sake of the theory of the art of war, you must answer the question, what did go wrong? Because that's, at least in this specific context, what you also need to know to avoid that situation if possible, and therefore the thing emerges, did this person actually did something wrong in the first place, right? Because it's very rare, this is the point I'm making, that someone gets defeated if he didn't do anything wrong specifically, right? And it turns out that we all do something wrong, because what we do is not scientifically calibrable, let's say, in reality, especially when we're dealing with such complicated questions like war, like politics, like society. So this is not much of a mistake of saying that person sucked because he was an incompetent general, but what in fact was known at the time, what is that in this normally kind of essentially artistical, closely to, let's say, at least artistical talent went wrong, or at least what was missed, right? And that is a responsibility that not only the historian has, but also the person you're studying had at the time, and that that must be figured out in a way or another. So von Clausewitz here says the result is always essential, right, to criticism and historical inquiry, right? It's possibly, if anything, methodologically speaking, the most important part of the inquiry, the one that guides you, that orients you, right? Because if anything, you know what happened. It's very rare, if you look at historical sources, also to know of a battle, of an engagement, and not knowing the result. The only thing you know most of the times is the result, and it goes with that, right? That you never find someone who instinctively says, okay, these guys clashed, and it doesn't tell you who won or who lost, right? Unless the narration is interrupted for some reason. But just think about this, and I would add in that regard that the result adds up to a series of quasi-statistical information that you can analyze at that point if you lack any other hint, right? If you study, for example, a context that is poorly documented. I mean, if one of the, I don't know, the parts that is fighting is continuously losing, well, chances are that something was going wrong from that side, right? And you must figure out how and why, right? So the idea that one side was kind of perfect, was doing everything perfectly and never making a mistake, and that the others were just losers who didn't understand anything is not a realistic historical assessment. There are mistakes from all sides, but even from the one who loses, there is some structural, systemic reason that you must find out. And it's always like that, because at the end of the day, these are systems that you're analyzing, and the system itself is not, you may not understand much of it, but still it functions for some reason that could be, in theory, mathematically calculated, right? But in theory, or better, ideally, right? In reality, unfortunately, we can't do that, but we still can understand what are the major motives for that outcome. That's why the outcome is so important, after all. And von Clausewitz goes on, it says, military history, with all its events, is a source of instruction for criticism itself, and it is only natural that criticism should throw that light on things which it has itself obtained from the consideration of the whole. This is also very important, we say it all the time. That is, the degree of refinement of criticism doesn't derive from a hyper concentration of all the possible elements until you haven't pro forma, let's say, you know, kind of spotted everything and trying to understand it deeply, right? It takes actually much greater value and quality and results from the the general understanding of things that also were going around that, right? And not strictly the same information we have. This is very important methodologically speaking, because it can be extended to a bit all the history of warfare. Like if you pretend to study just, I don't know, an army in a very specific period and of time and space, you don't consider what the hell was going on all around, you will not become a good military historian. You will maybe know a lot about that army, but still not framing it and its importance and evaluating it and judging it, you know, with something validly as a military critic. And that's why we have such very few amount of people who understand warfare, because warfare should require this prolonged effort to be understood, but also a complete education about at least the essentials of military history throughout all human warfare, right? Which is rare to find, and instead now we tend to hyper concentrate on. The same goes with strategic analysts that on average are kind of, who are they? First of all, should open a huge parenthesis now. Everybody thinks, has a blog, thinks to be a military analyst. That's a strategic analyst. Not quite the case. Serious strategic military analysts are people who can study, for entire years. certain scenarios, like with a huge amount of information. Also, where these scenarios progress, so it's very complicated, and then coming up with something historically valuable, maybe when the thing is over, or at least when more evidence has been collected. That's a very serious effort that is in fact required by political and military institutions that require reliable data, right? The guy who looks at the news and pretends to criticize them without any further insight in the thing is not going to make a good job after all. And naturally we all approximate our judgment. Like, this is what von Clausewitz is telling us, is that don't think to be all this, experienced and cocky and arrogant. He will say it afterwards, because you have discovered a source and then you think now you're special. That's not good. And our other critics that are more ahead of you will actually look at you and think you're not very good in the first place. So also staying humble is very important in this context, and it's better to learn than to speak sometimes, which is kind of ironic to be said from a person that speaks hours every day talking about this stuff. But this is another matter of more, okay, let's look at this stuff together and then let's reflect on it, which should be the thing, right? I think it's very important even to put yourself on the test of things you say, right? If I didn't come here to make videos, I would have not posed myself certain problems also to be of a certain level of accuracy, because I would say, well, it's only within me and I can be self-indulgent, right? Instead, if I have to deliver content, it's gonna be listened by how many are you now? Almost 1,500. At least if not all of you, a consistent part of you, well, I will try to make a more sound point than the average. So this pressure is also required. That's also why the average new commentator, on average, in fact, is not such a great analyst, right? So we try to bring it at least to the next step, to a better step. So consideration of the wall, okay, and von Clausewitz goes on and says, if therefore it might wish in some cases to leave the result out of the consideration, it would be impossible to do so completely. And we have seen how. Then he goes on and says, but it is not only in relation to the result, obviously, that is with what takes place at the last that this embarrassment arises. The same occurs in relation to preceding events, therefore with the data which furnished the motives to action, right? Further complication. Surprise, surprise, it's not just about the outcome of a battle, but the battle that you have to analyze, right? And the battle is simple. Think about a campaign, right? And think about, at that point, the political motives that brought to the campaign. There is nothing more difficult to do that is setting a starting point when you have to tell the story of a war, of a battle, because it's complicated, right? And you must take in consideration so many other factors that are complicated in turn, right? So what von Clausewitz is saying here is that the same problems that we have seen there occurred with determining why even an outcome was the one it was. Also, let's figure out how complicated it will be to do the same thing towards all with all the causes that we have spotted that are already extremely complicated to find out, to objectivize, right? So it's an enormous task, right? So von Clausewitz says, criticism has before it, in most cases, more information on this point than the principal in the transaction. This is very important, that is normally ex post, the historian knows more about the event than the person who was actually within it. This is very important. It's partly connected to what we were talking about before concerning the the non-teleological link between living in a time in history and actually knowing that time in history. And this statement starts from the the assumption, which is generally true if you are a professional historian, that before your inquiry on a certain event you have collected a sound amount of data, right? That have to do really with concerning to the event that you're studying, also with what happened before and what happened later. Naturally, this data is systematized. It presents some problems within it. But it's based on some evidence that you have collected. So the point of this data is that it's not necessarily quantitatively better, quantitatively more than the commander at the time, because it's obvious that the commander knew by far more things than you do, but it's qualitatively superior. That is to say, it's a banal example, but if I were to collect the news of what happens in one day, and then just reading what a journalist wrote about it the day after, generally speaking, that person has studied the thing and has also built a narrative. It is true, but at least to you it kind of makes sense as a more composite thing. Well, that's what historians do. And if you consider, I don't know, all the amount of things that were eventually collecting about all the interviews, banally speaking, that were collected after a battle, right? Those can help a freaking lot to determine what happened, more than, I don't know, just the memoir of the general who fought in them. Like, those can be some of the most important information. But if you collect lots of other evidence, you can start building up something that maybe was not even in the general's mind at the time, but you can figure it out in some way. That is not such a striking piece of evidence like the commander's memoirs could be, but you kind of get an impression of how things went that you have much more evidence to reconcile with. Like, a commander doesn't know all what was happening on the battlefield, right? Other people know, those who were there. So you understand even here how complicated this step is, right? And how, however, it is true that generally speaking, military historians tend to realize more about warfare than very often the people who are in it, right? This is a statement that probably you will not meet with many fans, but objectively, if you don't have historical, you don't make an historical inquiry in a certain event, you may have ever lived in it, but still not fully understanding how the thing went, right? And this doesn't mean that the person who was there cannot contradict you, cannot say, well, according to me it's not like that, but it's still that single person, right? I've met, I've seen, for example, there's a lot of interviews of veterans that are talking about military events in which they were, and I mean, just by reading a pair of books you can learn a ton more of what they're just trying to tell you about. So it's this is not to reduce naturally the importance, to downsize the importance of people who were in those situations, etc. It's vital, because without them we couldn't know, in fact. But still, there is an enormous work that goes beyond what the individual knows, and that is the inquiry itself. That is very, very costly, and that's why we have such huge amount of books, of information stored everywhere, because that's evidently what we need in order to figure out things, not just human memory, individual relations, right? It would be impossible. It would be a totally chaotic world. And historians do this, essentially. And von Clausewitz says, now it may seem easy to dismiss from the consideration everything of this nature, but it is not so easy as we may think, right? In fact, the knowledge of preceding and concurrent events is founded not only on certain information, but a number of conjectures and suppositions. This is a big problem, right? So all the data you gather, as we have seen, is not pure knowledge, it's not pure information, it's not the truth, right? It's part of the historical reality as such, because history has a reality on its own, meaning that is the evidence that is collected and how this is interpreted according even to the criticism. But it's never never devoid by conjectures and suppositions. It's always impure in some ways. Von Clausewitz then writes, indeed, there is hardly any of the information respecting things not purely accidental which has not been preceded by suppositions or conjectures destined to take the place of certain information in case such should never be supplied. Now, it is conceivable that criticism in after times, which has before it as facts all the preceding and concurrent circumstances, should not allow itself to be thereby influenced when it asks itself the question, what portion of the circumstances, which at the moment of action were unknown, would it have held to be probable? In other words, there are certain factors that are not known at the time of the decision, when the decision is taken. So how can historical criticism say, okay, let's say that knowledge that is hidden was maybe the better option, because it wasn't known at the time, right? So it would be impossible to criticize the commander in that situation for not having spotted that information, unless you go back, right, and you try to even understand why that didn't happen, which could effectively be related to some fault in that regard. But even at the same time, we've seen that for von Clausewitz, war is always waged in situations in which commanders do not know even the half of things that should be known in order to take a decision with a good degree of success. That should be at least the best decision, not maybe the one that ensures you a victory, but still the best possible, right? So this is a very important point after all, because it makes you immediately understand that whoever criticizes this thing ex post is it's not really cheating, but it should be aware that still in the judgment that is expressing about that commander, that information was not known. So it wouldn't be like solving a puzzle, saying, okay, this was the best thing you should have done since the beginning, because even if reality was in the way it was, at the time it was maybe not a good way to know that. And if had maybe that commander invested more resources to know better certain things, still maybe he would have lost other opportunities or resources. Things could have turned another path that you can't know, because we don't know effectively what happened there, even as we have seen, even at the end, even after there's been a huge inquiry, because still that knowledge is imperfect, right? So the military historian is a bit luckier to know a lot of things that have been studied also by lots of other people before him, so that we dispose of fairly reliable information, let's say accurate information overall, right? We at least know how to frame most of what we're studying at this point, but still this doesn't solve the problem in most of the circumstances. And von Clausewitz says, we maintain that in this case, as in the case of the results, and for the same reason, it is impossible to disregard all these things completely. That is to say, once again, just know that whatever you're reading in history, that's not actual truth. I mean, it's never supposed to be, but not because there is the evil guy that conspiracy theorists like to imagine in every single moment that, like those idiotic statements like history is written by the winners. No, history is written by historians, and historians have huge difficulties in the first place to sort out what the hell happened, right? And generally speaking, history is also a ground in which there is a possibility to be contradicted even by those who maybe are from your same side but have still maybe a different agenda, even if it's biased, right? So that we can spot very interesting things, because what's the society where someone wrote something and there was no objection of sort ever, right? There's never been a word like that, even if that had been true in a totalitarian regime where, you know, just certain books were printed, etc. Every person had their own vision of the thing, had their own individual experience, had their own there were also the people who actually did this, and they had accomplices, they had people who had told them to do. So history can never be an entire lie. There is always some truth in history, but at the same time, history is constantly rigged by the uncertainty of the information, of the evidence which is based. Because evidence is incomplete by definition all the freaking time. Then von Clausewitz writes, if therefore the critic wishes to bestow praise or blame upon any single act, he can only succeed to a certain degree in placing himself in the position of the person whose act he has under review. In many cases he can do so sufficiently near for any practical purpose, but in many instances it is the very reverse, and this fact should never be overlooked. So this means, like, be aware when you want to criticize someone, right? Because you will always be substantially abstracted from the reality this person was in, right? So even if you can actually afford some better understanding, this understanding is still not telling you the whole thing. Especially, as we will see now, you would have not necessarily done better in that condition. So your criticism should be at least always aware of the fact that whatever that was going on, it was like very, 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 very difficult at the time to take action, as you maybe can grasp that it would have been better to do, which definitely was not easy at the time. And von Clausewitz says, but it is neither necessary nor desirable that criticism should completely identify itself with a person acting. In war, as in all matters of skill, there is a certain natural aptitude required, which is called talent. This may be great or small. In the first case, it may easily be superior to that of the critic, for what critic can pretend to the skill of Frederick or Bonaparte? Therefore, if criticism is not to abstain altogether from offering an opinion where eminent talent is concerned, it must be allowed to make use of the advantage with its enlarged horizon of force. So it's what we have just said. Don't think that you're better, as is we say all the time actually on Schwerpunkt. Don't think you're better than people who lived in the past. Right? You're more capable or more intelligent than a person who lived 1,000 years ago. Right? You're not. You're just in a different way, and you're not definitely best suited for coping with that world than those people were. And von Clausewitz goes on, it says, criticism must not therefore treat the solution of a problem by a great general like a sum in arithmetic. It is only through the results and through the exact coincidences of events that it can recognize with admiration how much is due to the exercise of genius, and that it first learns the essential combination which the glance of that genius devised. Now, so what does this mean? It means that when you evaluate the performance of a commander, you can't reason on a linear scale, right? There is not like you can't say there is a. I mean, it's a kind of an unrelated thing, but I mean, what's the best weapon, right? If you don't give any context, that the question by itself has literally no meaning whatsoever. Like there is nothing like the best option until you you assess clearly what the context in which it should be employed is. And as we realize, it's even if you were to assess that, I mean, to have this greater understanding of the commander in that given moment, you should always realize that awareness is being acquired ex post, and that the person at the time was making a freaking effort to sort out what the hell was going on. This is also a non-linear process. I mean, we don't know what is happening in the head of the commander at that point, or even around him, in the sense of what information is exposed with, right? Is exposed to. So it can't be represented as a, I've rated him 5 stars because that's silly. But let's say the thing we can do instead is to actually appreciate in that regard. If we are really good historians, we are able to assess such a deep level of the historical reality. I mean, what were effectively the capabilities of that mind to see through that mess and to actually spot the best option. And this thing cannot be done evidently by trying to be the person at the moment. Like, you can, but most of this awareness is this realization is what you can reconstruct by observing how much of the right choices were taken inside by connecting effectively the results, right, with the pre-existing situation. That's also difficult because, as we've seen once again, I mean, many battles, for example, are already positivistically explained. That is, someone tells you that that general won for that reason. Okay, then you don't have any other evidence about that battle, but the only evidence you have is that historians saying that. This is typical of ancient history. Well, you just have to stay at that and accept that that judgment has a historical weight, that if at least the outcome of that battle matches also with the judgment that is being expressed, it's the better, right? Which is also kind of obvious in the sense of, we would say, someone lost when it wasn't true. It actually happens. There are accounts in which you say one side won, the other, but that can also express in itself an historical reality. That is, maybe it was a particularly bloody battle, maybe it was a stalemate. It wasn't such a decisive victory, but normally when there is an overwhelming victory, it always that says, okay, we won otherwise, right? So, but in that regard, we are not always so lucky to get to the point of, like you can do, for example, in the Napoleonic era. Here from Clausewitz is thinking especially about those times that really begin to be very important teaching grounds for military historians, because they actually display this. I mean, not always, not so clearly, definitely, but in some exemplary cases, of course, they do. This possibility of connecting, I mean, the pre-existing situations with the results, passing through the genius of, at least bridging that gap, observing the genius of that commander, right? Because certain things are not so likely, and sometimes we even know that there was a precise planning that brought to that result, right? Take, I don't know, the campaign of the Fifth. I mean, take Austerlitz, for example. Well, Austerlitz is recognized universally as the greatest tactical, but also, I mean, if you look at the campaign itself, there is much to say regarding the of Napoleon, right? Accomplishment of Napoleon, and that's a freaking masterpiece. And we actually know that Napoleon planned it all the way basically how the thing went roughly, and that achieving that extraordinary victory. So that's an example that on the basis of which you can really measure someone's genius. Sometimes you really can't. So this judgment also entails, however, that not just a military awareness, an awareness of the military situation, but all what concerned the surroundings. As we were saying in the previous days, for what concerns Edward III of England, for example, you can understand the greatness of that man if you just evaluate the battles fought by him or by his generals according to his tactical precepts, right? You have to analyze how he really changed English politics, and how he really shaped a state even before than an army, right? So that's seriously important, and it can't be taken out of the equation unless you want to effectively degrade, downsize and alter actually the objectivity of that assessment. That's why military history is so complicated, because it's very easy to pretend to explain things simply, but sometimes you don't understand the greatness of a person until you take out some of the greatest chunks of what happens on a battlefield. After all, tells you a few about an individual, right? It's more what happened before it, and all the planning and all the campaign and all why he got there in the first place, that have a sense. You can't. There are figures that went there and just did it, but with an astonishing planning, with a great perseverance, with a vision that at that point can make you understand, okay, yeah, he may have lost anyway, but the way he made it makes you realize that it was not a coincidence. It wasn't something, they rolled the dice on the spot and how they decided how the thing won. So this is even more relevant because it goes beyond the unpredictability of warfare. It's really like a plan, a line that has been envisioned before, and that it takes a person with determination, resilience, patience, nerves to carry out, right? And all that follows from it, that all the preparation for getting to that point. Sometimes we study battles as simple tactical encounters, as if it was just a video game match unfolding, right? But behind a battle, there is often an entire people, an entire country, an entire culture that has put the very best efforts into that. And in a day of blood, everything can be destroyed, right? And so just think behind that, all the forces that move and all the cause-effect relations that bring to that point. Most of the times, unfortunately, we don't know much about it, but it's just enlarging the scale of this inquiry that you can understand better, paradoxically, what happened. This can be criticized in some way, because that is to say, okay, well, then you're kind of deterministically acting because you think that all the factors had to arrive to that point. Well, but there is an intention, right? That it's not random. It's random because you can easily see that there are lots of things that are happening that were not foreseen, but still there was an effort to overcome them, right? So things do not come by chance, and it makes you see how the decisions sometimes of even of a humble person in all this picture can really change a lot. Then von Clausewitz says, but for every, even the smallest act of genius, it is necessary that criticism should take a higher point of view, so that having at command many objective grounds of decision, it may be as little subjective as possible, and that the critic may not take the limited scope of his own mind as a standard. So this is it, right? If you don't enlarge the view of this all, you can't fundamentally assess, you can't dimension, you can't put in perspective, right? That's why I have fighting my little crusade against hyper specialization in these fields, because yeah, you can be hyper specialistic in the sense you focus on a specific topic, but this is not exclusive of having a sound general education, which most people, most specialists today do not seem to enjoy, right? There is a level of narrow-mindedness which is quite astonishing, right? That doesn't make you really a better person, even in your field. And this is often, in fact, well demonstrated when there is an interdisciplinary approach to things. That is, people simply relying on other specialists' work, but never, trying to maybe to criticize that, because they say, okay, well, he knows what he's doing. You can't actually reason like that, especially at this point. We are tearing apart the barriers that exist between subjects in some ways, because we realize that so many things do not work after all, in that we continuously do mistakes, because those are somewhat necessary for didactic purposes and to categorize certain things, but they don't help to acquire higher quality of knowledge. And that's quite an interesting thing as well. But the whole trick is to realize that all this is happening without balance, that life generally happens without balance, that we are in a situation in which everything changes, but still we have to make sense of it, like we have to live through it. And that's what actually increases our skill. So it's really, if you want the answer, it lays in there, that if you prepare certain tracks, this and to follow regularly, these are limitative. Like, you should educate people in realizing that you must essentially know what you will have to deal with, but that also that until you don't deal with it properly, you can't know how hard it is. With history, it's really like this. There is no stable ground, right? We have to start from assumptions, from conjectures, from hypotheses, because the evidence is not so clear. And if you want to build something more consistent, you must have the courage of starting with a theory, proposing something, and that's initially devoid of foundation. So maybe that's wrong as well, right? But that's why excluding foundations allow you to also be more flexible, to be able to revise this judgment and to get to a better stage of information. So, and what von Clausewitz said here is also very important. It is the critic also is narrow-minded. I mean, he literally states that, he must enlarge his vision, he says, because that the critic may not take the limited scope of his own mind as a standard. That is to say, most of the problem we have with history is our own mental limits, right? It's our own faults and insecurities and laziness, and superficiality, and our things like these. But that's a deep limit. Like, the critic has this unmerciful task also of being exposed to other criticism. That is what historians are constantly. And peer reviewing is also something savage sometimes, because there are many problems also to this we will have to address at some point, maybe not now. But what is also a healthy criticism? I mean, how far do critics actually go beyond their own intellectual boundaries, right? That is not to say you have to believe in things that are just hypothetical, conjectural by definition, but understanding the implication of a theory is not an easy business. It's not that everybody will read a theory, but most innovative, important, and successful theories initially were simply excluded, marginated, even silenced, because maybe silenced when someone understood their greatness, they wanted to conceal it, but sometimes they're not even understood, right? Largely, people may not know what the hell you're talking about. So it gets there also to have the ability of getting yourself clear, to clarify yourself, to explain yourself effectively. Then von Clausewitz writes, this elevated position of criticism, its praise and blame pronounced with a full knowledge of all the circumstances, has in itself nothing which hurts our feelings. It only does so if the critic pushes himself forward and speaks in a tone as if all the wisdom which he has obtained by an exhaustive examination of the event under consideration were really his own talent. That is also a very bad thing to do, that is to say, okay, I know more than the person that was there, just because that's all what we know historically. That's pretty arrogant, but we do it all the time. That is, we have this kind of patronizing judgment over historical characters as if they were all imbeciles and we know better, right? And that's a very, very widespread attitude towards history. It happens all the time. I mean, it happens also to me when I try to always to stay very humble, to say, as I've done this video and many other occasions, like saying, never think to be more intelligent or capable of these people. And I can tell you that, in fact, the more I study, especially because I study military history in this regard, and I feel very much what is being said in this passage, because it makes you understand, especially when there is a lack of... I'm studying a period in which we don't really have a great understanding of the actual genius that was there. Like, there are, von Clausewitz explained this at the beginning of Vom Kriege, there are certain historical situations in which there's not much of an intellectual development of a society, or also that there are geniuses that, however, cannot find, you know, their right place, or that they don't have enough means and resources to be highlighted. I mean, to emerge as geniuses, right? How many Hannibals existed in the Stone Age, right? And we know nothing about, because they didn't have the means to prove that, right? Or even in the Middle Ages, people say, Middle Ages, medieval warfare was rough, and it was not, first of all, but also there were less means available to single people, so that we can't see most of the time how far could some talent was, but the talent was there, right? It's just it couldn't find sometimes an adequate field of application. So since I study exactly the Middle Ages, it happens to me that I see that there are actually some outstanding commanders that evidently stand out for their genius and talent, and there is no doubt about this. So we are lucky. But when it gets to see that, I mean, but when it gets to understanding what actually happened in the battle, like some sources, yeah, they say, okay, this general understood this and did that, okay, but for the overwhelming majority of encounters, you lack this direct connection, right? You can't. I mean, the sources may even claim that this battle was won thanks to the intelligence, the wisdom of this commander, but how that concretely happened, and especially what were the alternatives, is also a problem. And even more than that, when someone loses, there's this tendency to dismiss their abilities, like saying, you know, these people were bad, were doomed. Like, this is this deterministic take on history that, when you study military history, crumbles, because it simply cannot hold, right? It's as much as free will, as much as determinism. In the studies, you can't tell which one wins or loses. But even in there, especially when you know a few, being so, so, I wouldn't say just, I mean, so peremptory, let's say, in the historical judgment, I don't think it's very intelligent, like, because it sounds as if the the options after all were limited, and I know actually very extremely, actually people were much more intelligent, of course, than me in this regard, because there were partly also people who taught me something. And sometimes I see that maybe when they don't know a specific environment better than maybe I can do, um, they tend to, okay, I mean, to rest a bit too much on the positivistic explanation, right? Which is what I also do when I am presented with a situation that I don't know, and I say, this was such a great commander, everybody knows that, so that's basically why he won, because it was a genius. But we often forget that that judgment actually stems from an actual history that has assessed these extraordinary capabilities, and that's not just a matter of opinion. When you start studying history, it's mostly like that. That was such a great general. I mean, literally, if you look at most of YouTube comments under historical videos, documentaries, it's like that. This guy was so great. He was such a powerful ruler. Right? People are, people who know history the least, I think they're obsessed really about the concept that, he was just a great leader, but eventually not explaining all the enormous machine that was behind these people most of the times, and also why that was actually a great leader. That is not just because he scored a victory, but why he scored that. That's where it really lays the judgment, right? And if you miss that step, you're not really talking historically. You're just talking subjectively about things you heard and repeat, and that's fundamentally it. We all do it, but once again, people who study history seriously shouldn't do it. And I think that there is also a limit in this regard that stems, for example, by saying, the picture is so very complicated. Are we sure that saying that we can't really get to a definitive answer is maybe not a limit of the intellect of the person who is studying that system, and maybe another has a kind of a greater talent itself in judging history? That's also a problem. But believe me, it's very difficult, in my opinion, most of the times, to even assess certain things, and to we also live in a society that likes to disclose much, to talk freely about certain things without getting to the technicalities of it. And it's normal, because we can't be expert about everything, but it's still an option you have to take in consideration. But the real beauty of this is that there is always room for improvement, that even things that seem to be settled can be revised and to be improved, right? I'm reflecting with this. There can't be a definitive answer either, but if you acknowledge a certain quality of a system that you do know from the historiography that nobody studied like you did, right? It's beautiful to get to one point in which you may possibly know more than anyone else on a certain topic. Well, that is empowering, and it's what also, however, burdens you with a greater responsibility, is to explain this and to speak your mind and to be accepted, and that's not easy as well. Then von Clausewitz says, palpable as is this deception, it is one which people may easily fall into through vanity, and one which is naturally distasteful to others. It very often happens that although the critic has no such arrogant pretensions, they are imputed to him by the reader because he has not expressly disclaimed them, and then follows immediately a charge of a want of the power of critical judgment. This is exactly what we were saying. That is, the person who is reading you may actually misunderstand what you say. I mean, misunderstand your criticism in the first place, and criticism in this regard sometimes is very I mean, is actually very heterodox to the military judgment in itself. I mean, just to make an example, how many military judgments, let's say, are still actually influenced by where you're from or what you believe in? I mean, how biased are you? Right? If you, I mean, you can actually profitably study a person character through the topics that the character is interested in. Let's say, war for you, the greatest generals in history. If you were to answer, I mean, it would be very easy for a person who has a minimal understanding of those characters to understand why do you come with those actually, and also to spot how biased you really are. So unfortunately this happens all the time, and that is paradoxically also positive, because it, as von Clausewitz is saying here, it actually pushes other people to criticize you in turn, right? But in part it's your fault, because you might have expressed yourself better, and you know, it's difficult, because also speaking your mind clearly and taking into consideration everything is complicated, and a person may equivocate further what you're trying to say. So it's really, really difficult. That's why simplicity is better. That's why criticism in this regard is also, I mean, it's beautiful how von Clausewitz also in this passage basically says that, you know, you're not obliged to be critical, right? You can study how things went, but not saying this guy was an idiot because he failed, right? The best thing most of the time, subjectively, is saying simply we don't know. We don't know. It happened to me many times to spend an astonishing amount of time studying about a certain battle, and you can't really say, you know, even in front of disasters that are not where you don't really know why they happen. I mean, when you know when they happen, but you're not really sure about but for example, where the responsibilities lays, right? Or which is okay, maybe it's not such a good example, because usually we know these things and we can spot there the incompetence, the responsibility, where the burden of the mistake falls. But you know, wait. I would say simply this: that it's through the continuous study of military history that you get that critical capacity to understand who did wrong. Right? And that's also the limit. That often not understanding, as we were saying before, is part of saying, okay, we may not, let's say, realize it because we don't know what happened, which is different from saying, okay, we may have a lot of evidence here, but not having the time or the interest to expose ourselves in a judgment. Look, there are differences, so even in here, it's a matter of deciding why and when to do it, right? But aside from this, von Clausewitz goes on and says, if therefore a critic points out an error made by Frederick or Bonaparte, that does not mean that he who makes the criticism would not have committed the same error. He may even be ready to grant that he had been in the place of had he been in the place of these great generals, he might have made much greater mistakes, which is totally true, right? I don't think I've judged many military events, but I've never claimed, and I don't think absolutely that I would have been better in those situations, right? Also because most of the times we don't even have the enough elements to judge whether they did good or not. This is also what von Clausewitz is really telling us. And he adds, he merely sees this error from the chain of the events and thinks that he should not have escaped the sagacity of the general. That's literally the best you can do. And this opens to many other fields, because think about ruses or ambushes or things that are specifically aimed not to be known from the other side. Now this happens all the time, so it's no excuse, but it opens sometimes to the idea of how often, for example, such tactics were employed in that specific warfare, and that could be really interesting to spot. Like, there are many things we have discussed in Schwerpunkt. I mean, tactics that start being practiced from a certain time onwards, apparently at least more structurally, consistently, and you say, but which were the the circumstances they were subjected to? Like, you can't even enact a tactic all the time as you wish. You must be in a specific situation. So that, if anything, increases the value from one side, but not necessarily makes the other appearing like an idiot, especially if there is no further connection at some point. So there are actually many points that are a bit cyclical at one point, unless you don't meet with the actual evidence. And then von Clausewitz concludes by saying, this is therefore an opinion formed through the connection of events, and therefore through the result. But there is another quite different. So before we go on, 1 second, this is very important, right? So this is always the same story, is connecting the cause-effect chain to the fact there's been a result, right? And that we can't judge anything if we effectively don't confrontate, if we don't face the most important evidence of all, that is how this thing ended, right? And then kind of going like crabs backwards and trying to sort out why it happened like that. Yes. But, he continues, there is another quite different effect of the result itself upon the judgment, that is, if it is used quite alone as an example for or against the soundness of a measure. This may be called judgment according to the result. Such a judgment appears at first sight inadmissible, and yet it is not. And then von Clausewitz eventually passes to examples we'll see next time. But he is also highlighting this other aspect that we have hinted at just right now, but that is in fact is kind of controversial. That is, can we judge a decision merely on the basis of the result? This is a very thought-provoking question, because von Clausewitz is telling us, all in all, how much does the result actually weight, right? And the answer is evidently a lot. And also, we can guess why at this point, having read the Vom Kriege up to this point, because basically we have seen, even as we said before in the video, that that coincidences in such complicated systems are not really rare as such. I mean, if you consider the influence as all coincidences and all the things that can happen, right? But exactly because the situation is so uniformly difficult for everybody in many ways, the result that naturally can be more or less definite. We were saying before that there are battles that really end without no winner nor defeated, like nor loser. I mean, that, or at least there is always one in some way, but we should understand what's the cost of that. In which that's in fact the result that discriminates in that regard. So that an overwhelming victory is rarely a matter of pure luck or chance. This is what von Clausewitz is telling us, so that that the result should always be taken into consideration as possibly the most important element, at least to start from methodologically, and that never ceases, because it's usually the clearer, the better evidenced, right, and sourced, rather than what happened before. I mean, what caused it effectively. All right. So for now we stop it here. Next time we will see other historical examples like last time. And okay, let's stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.